Ladies and gentlemen, the link online. Terry, you look relaxed. I caught you off guard with that intro, did I? Yeah, the mic is. Go ahead.
It was Barnum-esque.
Barnum-esque. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have with us once again the talented Lynn Desjardins.
Hello there.
The lovely Terry Haig.
Thank you very much.
And the wise and sophisticated Marie-Claude Simard.
Hi, everybody.
And what do we call you?
Just anything but
The
late for
host.
dinner, as they say. Right?
Yeah.
And in the control room, we have Chantal Saint-Sauveur back with us once again, controlling us more or less.
Trying to control us. Trying to
yes.
control you.
Me? Good heavens.
Carry on. Tell us what you're going to have on the show.
Carry on. Sounds like some of those great old British movies. Carry on.
Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Too.
All right. All right, coming up on the show, I'm going to be talking about a controversial historical figure in Canada, and a lot has been said about the founder of Halifax, especially by Indigenous groups. But a historian says the one-sided anger is rather misplaced.
I'll talk to someone who says Canada lags way behind in preparing for automation and the loss of jobs.
And Carmel left us a story about the famous Bata shoe family and the woman who created the Bata Shoe Museum.
And we'll have those stories and some of your comments coming up on this edition of The Link Online. Wait for it. Wait. Shut down. Oh, my. Well, we've got a controversial story to start us off this week, and history, I guess, sometimes depends on who is telling it.
Drum roll.
Edward Cornwallis was the founder of the city of Halifax back in the mid-1700s, but he had a rough go of it fighting off Indigenous attacks, and at one point he offered a bounty on Mi'kmaq scalps. Now, the Mi'kmaq in recent years have been agitating to have his statue in the city removed and his name expunged from geographical sites and buildings, saying his actions amounted to genocide. Now, I spoke to historian researcher Leo DeVoe of the Royal Society of Nova Scotia History. He says scalping was not uncommon long before Cornwallis arrived and after, and many claims against him are just not quite justified. He says all sides at the time had blood on their hands. And in this excerpt, I asked him what he was thinking when the city hastily removed Cornwallis' statue earlier this month.
And many others felt it could have been done in a different way. Back last April 2017, the Halifax Regional Municipality had passed a motion to set up a panel to review the matter of Cornwallis and make recommendations back to council. And instead, it appears to many that council were bullied by the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs of Nova Scotia to take down the statue first, and then they would participate in this panel.
But the issue is mainly around this whole thing of scalping and Cornwallis' edict to scalp Mi'kmaq warriors and so on. But scalping, in fact, had been going on before that, long before that in, we'll call them the colonies in the United States and in what is now Canada, and on both sides.
Yes, oh yes, it was certainly common practice. And by the way, what Cornwallis issued was what's called a bounty proclamation, and scalping was one option, taking them prisoner was another, and it was for Mi'kmaq warriors that had already attacked. He arrived in June with the settlers, reaffirmed the peace and friendship treaties that were established back in the 1720s, 26 to be exact. And then by the end of September, the settlement is attacked by the French-aligned Mi'kmaq, and those attacks continue even after he leaves.
Now, he's also accused of saying any Mi'kmaq warrior, woman, or child, and I don't think that's quite accurate, is it?
That's right, he didn't. And sometimes that's confused with a later proclamation by Governor Lawrence, who issues a proclamation and talks about a bounty being paid not for scalps but for prisoners of women and children if they were brought in.
But he was trying, as we say, he was trying to defend his young colony against attacks by the Mi'kmaq, and it seems that nobody is talking about that, but they're only talking about Cornwallis, because the Mi'kmaq, in fact, did kill men, women, and children.
Yes, that's exactly right. When we've had conversations, all of us in our own way have tried to have conversations with some friends of ours from the Mi'kmaq heritage side, in communities. And it seems, at least in the responses I've received, it seems like somehow the Mi'kmaq were justified in doing what they did, whereas Cornwallis wasn't. So I don't quite know how that can be rationalized.
How do you get that out to them and say, look, it's not black and white. Everybody was doing, what they thought they had to do, and sometimes it was pretty darn nasty.
Yes, yeah. Well, what's happened here is that you have some people who've thrown out some pretty simplistic analysis and terms such as genocide, which is totally out of context. That is not justified in the context of those times.
And that was an excerpt of my conversation about the controversy surrounding Edward Cornwallis in Halifax with historian researcher Leo DeVoe, and the full interview, the highlights section.
No, it's okay. But defending his own colony, what was he doing there in the first place?
He did invade.
He did invade.
Well, the French invaded first, and the French were fighting him. And they inspired. You know what? Listen to the interview.
As Mark said, it's a controversial subject.
It is indeed.
You're just drumming. That's fake news.
And you're from the alt-right. More coming up. Well, here's another subject that's controversial. We're hearing a lot about improvements in artificial intelligence and a new wave of automation, and that's causing great concern about the future of jobs in Canada and around the world. And Lynn, you looked into this issue.
I did, Mark. I spoke with Sunil Johal. He's a policy director at the independent think tank, the Mowat Centre, and that's at the University of Toronto. I wanted to get a better idea of how many jobs are projected to be lost, which sectors will be most affected, and what the government is not and perhaps should be doing about it. Mr. Johal, what are the effects of automation that we are already seeing in Canada?
So we've already started to see the effects of automation in sectors like manufacturing. So if you look at the auto manufacturing sector in Ontario, for example, it produces the same amount of cars today that it did about 15 years ago, but with 30% fewer workers. And that's largely as a result of car companies investing in technologies, robotics that can take on human roles. But in many other sectors, we're just at the cusp of seeing what will happen when we think about new technologies like artificial intelligence and how they could dramatically reshape sectors across the board. So whether we're talking about financial services, law, medicine, really any sector you can imagine, there's the potential for these new technologies to reshape the kinds of jobs that people in those sectors currently are undertaking.
So we can expect huge job losses in the future.
Potentially. There are a lot of different studies and projections around this. And for advanced economies like Canada, they range between 5% of jobs that currently exist all the way up to 45% or so could be eliminated over the next couple of decades. But we have to keep in mind there will also be new jobs created in that time as well. So we may not have cashiers anymore, but we may have more people involved in customer service roles on the floor of a grocery store, helping people find where different produce is. I think the reality we need to become accustomed to no matter what happens is there will be more churn in the job market, more people bouncing between different jobs, and in all likelihood we're going to see many jobs destroyed or eliminated and many new jobs created. So the question is, how do we manage those transitions for people so that they can maintain a foothold in meaningful employment for as much of their career as possible? So probably the main thing the Canadian government needs to start thinking about is skills training and skills retraining, especially for adults. So if you've got a 45-year-old bus driver who's been doing that same job for 20 years, and now autonomous vehicles are coming on the scene and might push that person out of a job, how do we make sure he or she has the supports necessary when they're out of their job so that they don't fall behind on rent or mortgage payments, they can continue to buy groceries, and then more importantly, importantly even is how can we make sure that person is retrained, reskilled for a new career, for a new occupation. And generally speaking, the Canadian government and both federally and provincially spend far less on what we call active labor market policies or skills retraining than most other advanced economies. And the private sector in Canada doesn't fare much better. The private sector is spending far less than they used to 25, 30 years ago in terms of retraining their own workers. So as we enter this new future where people are going to be switching jobs more frequently, the issue becomes how do we make sure they're equipped with the skills necessary to thrive in that environment. So skills retraining is definitely the big one. We could also look at a whole range of other social policy supports, so things like pensions, affordable housing, and childcare. All of those areas could be modernized so that people have better supports in place as they are switching between jobs or potentially out of a job, so that they don't bear all of that risk on their own, and that risk is being pooled amongst all members of society through public policy interventions.
And my conversation with Sunil Johal. He's a policy director at the independent think tank, the Mowat Centre at the University of Toronto.
It's interesting because I did a story just last week, I think. You know those giant mining trucks?
Yep.
The ones that each one holds like 40 or 50 tons or 300 tons or something, and that giant trucks. They're now without drivers.
Yep.
More and more of those things are without drivers. It's this giant truck all by itself going around.
But I mean, you eventually you run into what the thing that Henry Ford dealt with, which was he had to have people buy his cars.
Yeah.
And that's why he paid a living wage to his workers.
Exactly.
Right? So, I mean, the robots aren't going to be out there buying cars. Well, maybe they will. They're going to be self-driving.
Maybe artificial intelligence, the robot will buy another robot to do his work.
Exactly. Saturday afternoons at the at the used car lot. Okay.
Coming up, some of your comments.
I like this one.
Like that's me on the piano, eh?
You wish.
Turn your mic on when you're going to insult Mark, would you?
Next life, Montgomery.
All right, now it's time for some of your comments instead of Terry's. And a reminder, you can post your thoughts and comments, read the comments of others by going to the very bottom of each of our stories, and the form is there to fill. What are you laughing at?
I like the way you emphasize bottom there.
Yeah. Be careful.
He didn't mean it.
All right, let's go right away to this is a story, actually, Lynn, that you dealt with, and it was this kerfuffle about the pronunciation of some names at the Olympics. Do you want to just give a brief explanation of that story?
So damn complicated. You know, it's basically they're hockey players, Canadian hockey players at the Olympics. Some of them have French names, but they live in English provinces, so they pronounce their names the English way. Well, Hockey Canada asked the French announcer to please pronounce their names the English way. Well, everybody in Quebec, all the nationalists and the people who have, with good reason, a desire to protect the French language, got very upset and said, how dare you, this is an insult to the French. And the Hockey Canada is saying, but that's how they want their names pronounced. Anyway, it was a great big deal with headlines and everything. So Ursula Wagner commented on the story. She said, oh my goodness, what a terrible catastrophe. Some people don't seem to have real problems. And as I ended the story, by saying, the post by saying, well, many Canadians might be rolling their eyes, and perhaps some are very glad they live in a peaceful country where this is the worst horror that's making the headlines.
Well, you know, even the thing is that it made it to the Quebec Parliament and it made it to the federal government level.
Oh, yeah, the Heritage Minister said she was going to look into this.
Even though, as you say, these people are Anglophones. They grew up in...
Well, I don't know if that became clear before they all blew their tops or if that became clear after they blew their tops. Anyways, no one's apologized so far.
Speaking of the Olympics, here's a story about Olympic outfits. And this is actually from October of last year, but Flo wrote this week.
It's impossible to find the lumberjack baseball hat on the internet, even on l'Abbé website. Where can I find it?
And Martha Mantha added...
Well, did we answer that?
I'm also looking for the hat.
Yeah.
Does anybody know?
Well,
we put that in, but we don't have an answer?
No, we don't have an answer because...
We don't have time to look for the answer.
But it is interesting that they have these hats, but nobody can seem to buy them anywhere. So, anyway... So if you know where the hats are, you know what they are? They're they look like lumberjack.
You mean the checkered ones?
Yeah, the checkered
and
the checkerboard ones?
Yeah. All right. Moving right along. A bit of a tiff.
Yes, okay, right. I'm a lumberjack.
A bit of a tiff regarding another old story, and this was entitled How Canada Created American Football. Now, earlier, someone named Dave had written back in 2016, who cares who invented it? The U.S. dominates every sport. Well, this week, Toss Your Cookies answered, saying,
U.S. dominates every sport. Look up the word hubris. Hey, hockey, too. But I'm only quoting here. I'm quoting...
Wait a minute. The Americans beat us in the hockey game.
Yeah.
the girls. They beat the girls.
Well, the men aren't doing so well either.
No, we got beat by, who was it, Sweden or somebody? Do you know Mary Claude? Were you following that?
No, it's Germany.
Oh, great.
Chantal,
now we all
you
look
following
stupid.
that?
Now, maybe we should just go on before we dig ourselves in
Germany
deeper.
beat us?
We sent all these pickup players for, it's like the Spengler Cup.
See,
you know?
Chantal
Remember we
knows.
used to joke about the Spengler Cup when we had a radio show?
Well, that was a long time
That's a
ago.
long time ago. We got all these pickup players from Europe. That's the Canadian team.
I think we're going to rename the show Digression.
Digression.
Well, sure.
But I digress. Back to letters. We received another comment on the story about scientific anger over college degree in homeopathy. And this is from Anke Zimmerman.
It's a sad day in Canada when a few rogue medical doctors, most likely funded by Big Pharma, are able to intimidate a college into dropping any educational program that was approved by its board of directors after much careful research. Canada's a pluralistic society, and we all deserve a chance to learn what we want, to see for ourselves, to have a choice. That is freedom. That is democracy. So I guess we should also be funding research into flat Earth and... Geez, we're all in such a bad mood today. Hey?
What are you,
It's
some kind of comedian?
Science-based, evidence-based.
Well, homeopathy is, no?
You know what? There's less than one molecule of the ingredient in these preparations. It's hokum. Hokum.
How do you really feel?
I'm trying actually to get more letters.
All right, kids.
I'm trying to get more letters.
Settle down,
to
or I'll
come
send
in.
you to your rooms. Good heavens, I tell you. On the story, 375 million children live in areas affected by war and conflict. Regular visitor Peter Ashcroft in England wrote this.
How many cinema and television productions seem to promote conflict? Viewers are attracted to it as long as they do not live in such environments with personal loss of life.
All right.
Hey, and I wonder what Peter has to say about homeopathy. Peter, if you're listening,
Yeah.
send us something. I have a lot of respect for Peter.
Yeah, I love Peter.
right.
He came here and visited us.
Yeah,
He
it
did,
was
yes.
awesome.
Twice he's
From
done.
England.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a regular visitor. He's been
Hi,
with
Peter.
us. He's been with us for like
Love you, Peter.
a long time.
Yeah, when we used to be on the radio.
That's a long time.
That's a
Oh,
long
geez,
time
you're
ago.
going to get me to cry now.
I am.
Carry on.
All right.
All right, moving on. Finally, comment.
Come on, Montgomery.
No, this is good because this is a story that high-speed rail has been promised once again, and I have to say, Canada has been talking about this for decades.
What, is there another election coming or something?
Well, yes, indeed.
Oh, there
And
you go.
this is in Ontario. How astute of you to notice. Now, as I said, Canada's been talking about this literally for decades, and in spite of the vast distances between cities in this country, Canada is the only G7 country without high-speed rail. And anyway, to this promise, this time by the Liberal government of Kathleen Wynne in Ontario, John Head commented...
In his infinite wisdom, John said, "We will have colonies on Mars before this ever happens." I'm with you, John. We got an election coming in Quebec, too, and they promised high-speed
well,
rail.
watch all the roads get paved.
Yes, hell
in the
will
country.
freeze over before it happens. Mind you, with climate change, hell may freeze over. Who knows? I don't know.
But I'll probably get on the boil or something. All right, those are some of the comments for this week.
What are we doing next? I'm lost.
Well, we're going to have a music break, and then we'll
Okay,
do something.
good.
Now
Well,
we're
let's
going to
get
batter
paid.
shoes, kid.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Batter shoes. All right.
All right.
Back under control once again in the room. This is a story about the Bata Shoe Empire. And Terry, tell us a bit more.
Well, it began in Czechoslovakia in 1894 and grew to be a shoe dynasty. Think about that. A shoe dynasty. And that's S-H-O-E. It's not a Chinese spelling there. Okay. And worldwide enterprise. There are shoes in China. You understand that, Montgomery?
Yes,
That's a reference. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
In 1964, the headquarters moved to Toronto, Canada. Later, the idea behind a shoe museum was developed. The visionary behind Toronto's Bata Shoe Museum is being remembered this week. Carmel Kilkenny looked into the legacy of Sonia Bata. Her collection of 13,000 artifacts is housed in the beautiful shoebox of a building designed by architect Raymond Moriyama. When asked, Sonia Bata said her favorite shoes were the most recent ones, and apparently they were a pair of deep blue women's shoes from the 18th century acquired 2 weeks ago. Now, Carmel spoke with Sheila Knox, acting director of the Bata Shoe Museum, on Thursday to hear more about the life and legacy of Sonia Bata.
Sheila Knox, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
And first, my condolences on the loss of Ms. Bata.
Yes, it's sad days for us.
What kind of leader was she?
She was an amazing role model for all of us. She was an incredible leader. She had a vision, she had passion, and she had a real drive for excellence, and she really instilled that in everybody around her.
Let's go back to the beginning. Why did she start collecting shoes?
She started collecting shoes because she was traveling with her husband, the late Thomas Bata, who was the CEO of the Bata Shoe Company. And as she traveled throughout the world as they were setting up their various business operations, she became fascinated with what people were wearing on their feet. Now, this was back in the late 1940s and 1950s when many cultures in the world were still wearing their traditional clothing and had not adopted Western dress. Now we have everyone running around in jeans and T-shirts and sneakers, but in those days they were wearing their traditional clothing. And as a shoe company, of course, they were introducing Western footwear to those places, it's largely in the developing world. And she felt if she could bring home examples of these traditional shoes and examine them and understand what people in those countries were used to wearing, perhaps she could design footwear that was Western, but might have some of the same characteristics or appeal to their traditional shoes that they were used to wearing.
Her legacy is amazing with the Landmark Museum now in downtown Toronto. Who was responsible for the design?
That's the work of the architect Raymond Moriyama. And Mrs. Bata herself had a very strong interest in architecture, and Ray was very gracious in allowing her into the process and letting her become involved in the design of the building.
Tell me about some of the treasures in the museum.
Well, we have everything from ancient Egyptian sandals that are 4,500 years old to shoes worn by a ruler in India called a nizam, and his slippers are made with gold thread and have diamonds and emeralds and rubies around the edge of them. So, and then we have a very large indigenous collection, First Nations moccasins, as well as circumpolar boots from all the various Arctic regions of the world.
I imagine the circumpolar boots would be of great interest to many of us these days in this really cold winter.
Absolutely. And one of the crowning achievements of Mrs. Bata's work was that she was able to fund research expeditions into the Arctic where our researchers could live with and learn from elders who were still making traditional fur boots and be able to document the process, because this was also very much part of Mrs. Bata's vision that the methods of shoemaking that were in danger of being lost would be rescued and kept for posterity.
Her work as a philanthropist was widespread, I understand.
Yes, and she was very involved in many arts organizations. She also chaired the World Wildlife Fund Canada, National Design Council. She very much believed in giving back to the community.
What do you think she'd be most proud of?
I think she's proud of her museum. I think it was her passion and her dream to both build and house this magnificent collection of 13,000 shoe-related artifacts.
Sheila Knox, thank you for telling me about her.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Couldn't we just go to Imelda Marcos's closet?
Always with the...
But it's Canada. This is in
okay,
Canada.
it's
so,
CanCon.
Yeah,
All right.
CanCon.
So the Bata Shoe Museum will be hosting Manolo Blahnik, The Art of Shoes, in mid-May. There you go.
I bet you don't have any.
What do you call these babies?
I got shoes, you got shoes, all I got children got shoes. But MC, come on, join me.
What?
MC is actually a professional musician.
Is she?
Yeah, she is. Yeah, she's a cello player.
Nobody
Yeah,
told
she's
me
a
that.
cellist.
A cellist.
Anyways, I'm here to talk about food.
Yeah, my favorite
She went to one of the best
subject.
music schools in the United States, University of Indiana.
Wow.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Fabulous. We should do duets. I play flute.
Yeah, we have plans to play, Mark and I.
We do?
On a,
I'm a better musician than he is.
You are?
I had formal lessons for 14 years. Mark,
On the flute, really?
no, but
Yeah.
wait.
Yes, sorry, Bob.
St. Patrick is coming. We have to play a little something. For
Oh,
our
yes.
public.
Oh, Irish.
Because I actually specialize
Mark's
now in
gonna bring
Celtic
us-
music.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, on the cello.
On the cello.
Yeah.
So you're going to bring the cello?
Well,
Yes.
This is
next
all
time he's
yeah.
got a show.
Yes.
Of course you're going to bring.
I think
do
we
we
have to
a
plan
show?
this.
When does the 17th fall? Is it on a Saturday?
Ladies and gentlemen.
On a Friday?
The heck with the script. We're out of control.
Well, we don't have anything left on the
Okay.
script anyway.
Well, we
and
do.
we got
We can-
4
Yes,
minutes
okay.
and 40
but-
seconds.
Anybody wants to know the results of the Olympics, like how many medals we have?
Yeah.
How about switching to that?
Yeah, but it's going to be old news by the time the show airs on
No,
Sunday.
we're airing right
Yeah,
now.
this is
We're
live, Len. You didn't know that.
So
But it
let
gets
Television.
Here we go.
Sunday.
Canada, second place with 27 medals.
We beat our own record. We got one more than
And-
Sochi.
10 gold medals. So
10 gold medals.
we're doing pretty well.
Yeah,
So
but we're still behind Norway and Germany. But I
No,
don't-
no, we're ahead of
Yeah,
Norway.
this is
We're
good.
ahead of Germany.
No, for
Ahead of
golds, I
Germany.
mean, for
Yeah,
gold
but if you were,
medals.
no, think about this though. If you were,
what have I
much
done?
chance
if you were,
of getting
if you were at the Olympics,
Yeah.
would you? I don't know. I mean, if you didn't get gold, it's like there's first place and then there's
No.
Jack Todd wrote a great. Did you see Jack Todd's column about that?
No,
about
go ahead.
2 weeks
Gazette
ago.
columnist,
Just to
newspaper,
make
local.
it to the Olympics
Oh,
is
you got-
really amazing.
Oh, sure,
And
yeah.
Different athletes have different attitudes. And if you look at the marvelous figure skater ladies program from last night, Caitlin, what's her last name?
Sorry, it was
Simon.
Caitlin. No, Caitlin. Anyway, she said it so beautifully. She got a bronze and she was so gracious. She was so wonderful. And she was so happy and so pleased. And you know, Canadians look at that and they go, oh yeah. It's kind of nice. But then of course you had the women who lost
the hockey.
gold
Well, in a
for
shootout,
the first
which is
in a
ridiculous.
shootout, yeah,
I'm
and
sorry.
they were weeping. It was
Nothing should be
sad.
decided by. As an old sports writer, no championship should be decided in a shootout. I'm sorry.
I agree with that.
I don't like shootouts
no,
either. I mean,
no.
they could go. I mean, they could go to sudden death overtime, right?
Play
Yes.
sudden death
Play
overtime.
sudden death
That's how you
overtime.
do it.
Yeah.
Which is not about massacre
Or
and murder.
another period
no
or
guns
something. You
involved.
Play one more period than sudden death or whatever. But
Yeah.
shootouts are a joke.
No, I don't
No,
like shootouts.
shootouts
Does
are
anybody
It's like
terrible.
playing a
like
whole
shootouts?
baseball game and then we have the guys come up and then we have a home run hitting contest or something.
Exactly.
It's
That's-
stupid.
yeah.
It's just stupid. And think of the pressure on the poor goalies.
Yeah.
Like you want to. It's terrible.
You know.
Yeah, well.
All
But
that
you know, I
pressure.
mean, one of the things. I mean, have you been following the Olympics, Marie?
No.
Sort of.
No,
A bit.
It's curling. Every time you turn on the television, it's
It's
curling.
very late at night for us if you want
That's
to
right.
watch
That's true,
it.
and we get up early.
They have replays
Yeah,
all
I
over
know,
the place.
but
No, but
not as
I haven't been following that much, but I have to say I did watch Virtue and More.
Yes. Oh, I have pictures in our
Beautiful.
Yes, because
Exactly.
Lynn did a blog. I
Exactly.
did 2 blogs. They were
Beautiful
awesome.
stuff. Beautiful
they,
stuff.
They were just
Here.
terrific. There they go.
I mean,
yeah.
They've been together a so and they're not even boy and girlfriend.
They've been
They've
years
just been
since
buddies.
they were 8 and 9 years old.
were
They've been
buddies, yeah.
skating
I
together.
have a picture of them.
That's
God.
that's a picture I posted. They were skating together, 8 and 9 years old. They've grown up together. I think they briefly went out together, but apparently they are not romantically inclined. Although, you know, the way they look into each other's eyes, I think that's part of the appeal.
Well, we
And
had that kind of on television when we did television together. you and me, yeah.
Sweet.
You used to ask me all the time.
well, you used to look at me, Terry. I mean, what can I say?
This was television.
Good thing this is radio, except it isn't anymore because now we're here.
Good thing the
It's video.
time's ticking down because it's getting sillier by the
Well,
minute.
that's okay.
Well,
This is the show that is not only informative, but it's entertaining.
You think anybody likes listening to us?
Yeah, look, they're lining up
Okay.
outside the studio right now.
Anyway,
Montgomery.
let me tell you
that's-
guys
yes.
that my
Marie-Claude's
next
turn.
cooking column will
Yes.
be in a Mohawk home.
Yes.
Yes.
So I will need you guys to translate
Indigenous.
it because I will be publishing it on the English site too.
Okay.
So I will write
You're
it
going
in
to
English. but
Ganawage?
yeah.
Cool.
That indigenous community, so we get to try some
Yeah.
indigenous food. You're actually going to bring some in, you think? Maybe?
Yes, I will.
If we're good, if we
Yeah.
were nice to you.
What is it you're cooking or making?
I think it's cornbread. It's cornbread, but Mohawk way.
Okay.
Very traditional.
All right. Well, we've done it. We've wasted another half hour, as they say on Click and Clack. And so for Linda Jardin, Terry Haig, Marie-Claude Simard, and Chantal Saint-Sauveur in the studio, wondering what the heck we're doing. I'm Mark Montgomery. Take care until next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.